Okay, let's move forward with this resilience and try to see how the concept of resilience, we have been looking at it and talking about operationalizing it, can actually be linked to other frameworks like disaster management, disaster recovery, and so on. It's quite clear when looking at this approach to resilience that most of what is operationalized under the concept of resilience has roots in a rather long academic and professional past. This is not at all a coincidence, as I consider the alternative unfeasible at best. At best, we have had enough introductions of new terminology that have aggressively redefined the predecessors to claim novelty and precedence. For instance, even early definitions of disaster management or emergency management included prevention/mitigation and preparedness in addition to response and recovery, while the rhetoric advocating for disaster reduction or disaster risk reduction decades later redefined these predecessors to merely involve reactive response and recovery. So it wasn't still about proactive resilience building to stay on the sustainable development pathway. The reason for this may have been the profound imbalance in favor of reactive over proactive activities in practice. But if we consider that an acceptable reason for such terminological slant, then I believe the successors are in trouble too, considering the continuous focus on disaster response. So we're still kind of stuck in the disaster response as a reactive response rather than proactive resilience building. I have nothing against the inventions of first order disaster reduction and then disaster risk reduction as attempts to increase the focus on proactive activities. However, to advocate for these new concepts by consciously stating that their conceptual predecessors ignored proactive activities is just not fair. They did have the idea of preparing to mitigate disasters as well. That amounts to risk reduction, which is what resilience is about as well. Similarly, climate change adaptation was at least initially introduced as something novel and distinct. However, immense focus on adaptation to moderate actual or potential harm or adaptation to exploit beneficial opportunities has spurred intense debate over the extent to which disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation overlap. So sometimes people have gone in independent directions, disaster management being about immediate actions and responses with some activities to build resilience, whereas adaptation is almost entirely about looking at risks in the future and trying to get ready for them. You know, as I've discussed elsewhere in adaptation, throughout the Holocene or even before, human beings have always evolved by adapting. They are forced to adapt. Climate change, they adapted by migrating, by changing diets, by changing lifestyles, by inventing technologies, and so on and so forth. So adaptation now, it's just that it's needed in a very accelerated fashion because risks are evolving very rapidly and extreme events are coming very rapidly at us, especially as many definitions of climate change adaptation only include negative effects. For example, actions to reduce the vulnerability of a system such as an urban place or a city, population as a vulnerable population in a city, or individuals to the adverse impacts of adaptation of individual to the adverse impacts of anticipated climate change due to emissions of greenhouse gas. This definition is also interesting as it is linked to descriptions of categories of actual adaptation activities. These include protection, so disaster avoidance, preparedness, response, and rebuilding, which are described identically to the prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery of traditional definitions of emergency management and disaster management. So it's just kind of an argument about how resilience fits into all the other kinds of related concepts of adaptation, disaster, risk reduction, prevention, mitigation, preparedness, and so on. Instead of introducing resilience as a new concept that overrides all previous approaches to build a safe and sustainable society by managing risk and disaster situations, I intend to suggest how the most common conceptual predecessors fit this new framework of resilience. Okay? Including emergency management and disaster management from the 1970s to 1980s, and onwards, disaster reduction from the 1990s and disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation from the last decade, which is already, a little old in terms of where we are now. We're in the 2020s as opposed to 2000s or 2010s when the book was written. So, oops, did I skip something? Sorry about that. I had misplaced a slide there, so I'm going to continue after having reorganized it. So continuing along these lines of resilience into other frameworks of disaster management, disaster risk reduction, disaster preparedness, disaster response and rebuilding, prevention, mitigation, and so on. Let's see what IPCC had done. IPCC defines climate change adaptation as adjustments in natural or human systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. This is one of the most influential definitions and includes both negative and positive effects. So it's not just about adjusting to the risks which are generally implied to be negative, but also exploiting beneficial opportunities. So if the growing season becomes longer by spring arriving earlier and winter arriving later, if you had no pest infections increasing because of the winter delaying or frost days decreasing and so on, can you have increased yields because of CO2 increases? Do you have a CO2 fertilization effect on the crops to increase the yields? And so on. Okay, so you can think of many examples where in fact climate change may be creating beneficial opportunities as well. So this is one of the most influential definitions, although other definitions as well as the main focus of policy and practice more or less only include negative effects. Both potential and actual effects are generally included in this kind of definition. Adaptation covers, in other words, both proactive and reactive activities to manage risks related to a changing climate. So as I mentioned before, the key challenge for adaptation now is that the risk information related at the scales that matter are not still available. Some decisions are possible depending on which sector you are talking about. If you're talking about managing energies or water resources, the scales may be large enough, and current risks and future risks may be reasonably available, even though models are notoriously bad at doing precipitation as opposed to doing temperatures. But if you want to do adaptation for heat waves at a city scale or a sub-city scale, then you still don't have that level of information. Dynamic downscaling and other efforts are made, but doing this for the future projections is anything but trivial. So there are many challenges. Of course, other challenges include what we discussed for resilience in terms of economic, technological, administrative, political, and so on and so forth. So adaptation also faces those same challenges, including serious economic challenges in terms of mainstreaming adaptation and ensuring that there is always funds in the budget, room in the budget for adaptation. Proactive resilience building also amounts to the same thing. Since adapting to the potential negative impacts of climate change is by far the main focus, it has been suggested that it is more or less part of a disaster risk reduction practice in general. It is also interesting to note that the climate change sector has invented other concepts with large overlaps with the risk sector, such as adaptation assessment. So IPCC has had its own approach to defining risk, as I mentioned several times, as a multiplier of hazard, which comes, let's say, from the climate side. For IPCC, they are not necessarily considering earthquakes. Volcanoes are part of climate change as a forcing, but not as a hazard, and so on. Then you have exposure, and then you have vulnerability as well. So adaptation assessment of IPCC, mitigation, adaptation, impacts, vulnerabilities, focus on those sorts of things. The approach to resilience presented in this book is not intended to undermine existing approaches to build a safe and sustainable society. On the contrary, it consciously connects to them and between them while building a coherent framework for what we must do to manage the core challenge of humankind. I like this better, having also covered the other ways of thinking about resilience, because here resilience is part of the pathway to sustainable development with the Human Development Index and environmental footprint in mind in terms of the worst and the best, and resilience as a way of facing the deviations along the path and then coming back to the path to sustainable development. So that's the resilience part here, which is somewhat more holistic, I would say. So we'll come back and read the conclusion and wrap up this chapter. I hope all the concepts are clear, because we covered various aspects of resilience, human biases and challenges to resilience, operationalizing resilience, and resilience in contrast to other frameworks like disaster risk and so on. So we'll come back and conclude and then move on to the next chapter. Okay.